Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Michigan Notable Books Author Conversation video recording. My name is Matthew. I'm one of the librarians here at the Library of Michigan. And today we're here with Daniel Clark, who is the author of the book Listening to Workers: Oral Histories of Metro Detroit Auto Workers in the 1950s. So I want to thank you, Daniel, for being here. And so to get us started here, give us some background information on yourself and how did you become a writer?
Sure. I am a Michigander by birth. I grew up in Midland. I went to graduate school at Duke University in
Okay.
North Carolina. That was a long time ago in the 1980s.
Okay.
And by virtue of becoming a history grad student and aiming to be a historian, you become a writer because, well, we read
Mhm.
a lot of papers and
Mhm.
to get through
Yeah, I can
coursework
imagine.
and all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I guess the first main writing experience, if you do it, would be a master's thesis, but certainly the PhD dissertation.
Mhm.
There's an awful lot of research that goes into the preliminary work before you become a writer in that sense. But that was my first experience with long form writing and really trying to hone and edit what I was trying to say. Um, I don't think I am a writer. I write, but it's really a process. It's really hard work, and that's something I try to get across to my students as well. That the words they see on the page in a book are not the first draft. I guess I'm anticipating a question down the line here, but um, I think a lot of people who go to grad school in history, first and foremost, are readers.
Mhm.
We do a lot of
Correct. Yeah.
reading of books
Yeah.
and reading of sources, and
Mhm.
that's a little different skill set from writing. And so, it's a trick to find your own voice and to actually think of yourself more as a writer, as a producer of history, as opposed to a consumer of history.
Oh, interesting. Um, so thinking about this book, Listening to Workers, why do you write? And could you explain a little bit more about your writing process and maybe how this writing process has changed for you from the
Mhm.
time when you were a student with a master's thesis and dissertation up until this work?
Sure. Well, a couple big questions in there. I can get more to why this particular book, how it came about.
Yes,
But
please.
let me start with the second half of the question, which is about the process.
Yeah.
Um, Everyone has their own, I think,
Mhm.
and that's something
True, they
that
do. Yeah.
is hard to convince students of. They want to know the formula for producing a great.
There is no formula.
No.
Yeah.
And so mine is to first of all, spend an inordinate amount of time, not by history standards, but by
Mhm.
the lay person standard, doing research.
Mhm.
Um, for a book that came before this, I spent many years, actually months out of each year, reading microfilm at the University of Michigan Graduate Library. I would walk down the street to the bus stop and catch the Ann Arbor bus, down to the downtown area. And every day in the summer, I'd do that. And I'd see my neighbor, who was a middle school teacher, and she'd say, "What are you doing?" "Oh, I'm going down to do research." And the next summer would come along, and "What are you doing?" "It's the same book," and this happened season after season. And she said, "Oh, what you must be nuts," and this is actually part of the writing process. I'm addressing the question because for me, there has to be a mountain of research to sift through, and a lot of my thinking and preparation for writing occurs on bike rides and runs and
Mhm.
these sorts of things where I'm just wrestling with what I've come across, how I think it might fit together, how I might organize it. Um, and then it wouldn't be as true for the dissertation because there's no time limit on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But once you actually have well, I guess maybe 8 or 9 years or something, I wasn't trying to reach that
Yeah.
point. But with an academic job, if you're lucky enough to get a sabbatical, you've got like 4 months to just work on your project,
Mhm.
and the occasional summers that are free. And so I made a pact with myself, especially for this project and the one that preceded it. They're related, as we'll find out, that I would just write. I would take my mountain of research and I would write and I would write and I would write. And if I got writer's block, I would write over the top of the writer's block
Yeah.
and get back in touch with my sources. And the thinking being that a rough draft is much better than no draft. It's possible
Mhm.
to find ideas embedded in overwriting and kind of
Mhm.
verbose writing, unedited writing, and then work with them. And I'm much better at doing that and editing back down than
Mhm.
struggling for exactly the right sentence, exactly the right
Yeah.
word at the start.
Okay.
I know some colleagues who struggle and write the first draft, which is pretty darn close to the final draft. That's not me.
Yeah.
Um, so with this book, listening to workers, I had to cut probably about 80,000 words out of it to meet the
That is.
requirement for the press. They have word count requirements because of publishing costs. That's a painful part of the process, but it's common unless you're a world acclaimed novelist or something who can
Yeah.
write what they want. Uh,
Yeah.
and so um, for me, the process involves, then taking this 500 pages or so of rough writing and trying to shape it into something more coherent. And it takes me several passes, 5 or 6 for sure, until I'm anywhere near approximating the final tally for the word
Mhm.
count. Because I cling to my research. I found
Yeah.
things I really like. I really want to include it, and it's
Yeah.
hard to let go. But that's a big part of writing, realizing that sometimes less is more.
Mhm.
And with each pass through, I'm able to make tough choices a little bit more easily. So that's a big part of it. And then, of course, you send it out to other people to read.
Mhm.
And that's true from the press. They'll send it out to other people who will give substantive and sometimes stylistic suggestions, trusted friends,
Yeah.
to look things over. That's all part of the process as well. I think the first part of the question was why this book? Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, yeah. Why do you write? And particularly, why did you write this book?
Yeah. Um, well, um, I'll give a long-winded answer maybe, but
That's fine.
okay, yeah. I really became interested in oral history as a graduate student at Duke.
Mhm.
It was the oral history had certainly been well underway as a discipline, as a methodology at that point, and it
Mhm.
goes back ages. But it was really taking off in the 60s and 70s, and I started grad school in the early 80s. And so I took an oral history seminar. We had to have a topic, and I researched a strike in cotton mill town in Henderson, North Carolina, not too far away from Durham, where Duke is. And I really got the bug. Sitting in living rooms with people who had been involved in a life-altering labor conflict, to strike in these mills. I knew nothing about North Carolina. I was from Michigan, and so I had to have a topic that was somewhat close to Duke, and um, had some guidance there. But that actually became a book. Like Night and Day is the name of that book. So I moved back to Michigan. I
Mhm.
got this job at Oakland University, and I
Mhm.
needed a new book project. And I had 2 young kids. Okay.
Okay.
And I didn't want to have to travel far away to do research and wanted to be present. I considered myself, because of my first book, a labor historian, because I was looking at labor issues, and an oral historian. And so I thought, well, maybe I could do something related to the auto industry. Anyone who grows up in Michigan knows that the auto industry dominates much of the state, did at the time for sure. And it didn't take long in reading the secondary literature on the auto industry and the UAW, United Auto Workers, to realize that there hadn't been much research done at all on auto workers themselves. And one
Yeah.
of the reasons for doing oral history for me was to try to learn more about history, as they said at the time, from the bottom up.
Yeah.
We're doing research of people who ordinarily wouldn't leave records, wouldn't leave their
Mhm.
papers in an archive, people who would be hard to discover, except for birth records, death records,
Mhm.
problems, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and so I thought about what I would do, trying to do an oral history project regarding auto workers. And this was the early 2000s. It was quite a while ago that I was
Okay.
thinking about this project. And you know, it again doesn't take much time living in Michigan to hear about the heyday of the UAW and back when people saw went, the story went, could show up in an auto factory gate, be hired, and have a lifetime of secure employment. And most of that centered on the 1950s, that was the year of large, well, generous UAW contracts with automakers and auto workers entering the middle class, the heyday of the UAW, the heyday of the auto industry. And it seemed possible to go back that far from the vantage point of the early 2000s and still locate people who had been young adults, at least in those decades. People who had been older adults in the auto industry, well, they weren't going to be around anymore. But and so I focused on looking at the 1950s and had the problem then of trying to figure out how to find these people. At any
Yeah,
particular
I
point
bet.
in time, there might have been 500,000 people in the Detroit area, defined largely Metro Detroit, involved in the auto industry, but where were they in 2000, 2001, 2002, and how would I find them? It's hard to imagine a time without Facebook, a time without social media, and uh,
Correct.
yeah, but it's just not that long ago when I was able to locate people at union retiree meetings. Almost every union local has a retiree chapter affiliated with it, and I was able to get connected through friends, students, with one in Ypsilanti, one in Pontiac, and that got the ball rolling. But why this project? I really thought at the start that I would be able to at least figure out how people manage to live with in
Mm.
this time, or not manage to live, but how they thrived in this era of increasing wages and better benefits. And I thought that would possibly be the stories I would hear. I knew from the book Origins of the Urban Crisis by Tom Segru that African American auto workers in the Detroit area did not find the 1950s to be a heyday, that discrimination in the plants, automation, decentralization of the industry away from Detroit did not work to the benefit of Black auto workers. So that was kind of the rough sense of things I went into the interviews with. But I tried to put all that aside and
Right. Yeah.
just talk to people about their lives. That was my goal. I didn't want to come in and prove a theory. I didn't want
Mm.
to try to shoehorn anybody into a category
Mm.
that I thought would fit, but just to learn from them what they thought about their lives. And that was something that it was a little bit hard to communicate to the people I might interview because most of these auto workers, I define them as ordinary auto workers just to distinguish between activists and union leaders and rank and
Yeah.
file members. But most of them didn't consider themselves to be subjects of history or, historical actors. Just a number of times I would go and table to table and ask people if they'd be willing to be interviewed. And a number of people said, well, I don't know anything about Walter Reuther. He was the longtime president of the United Auto Workers, so
Mm.
I don't know anything about what you want to know. And I said, well, actually, no, I want to know more about your life and not necessarily about Walter Reuther. So the point I'm getting at is that the historian's challenge to find sources that can tell us about people who weren't famous and didn't leave papers behind kind of extended internally to the people I was trying to reach. Why would you want to
Mm.
talk to me? I didn't do anything
Yeah.
important, Um,
Mm.
and so you know, the why this project took on a new meaning when I started to do the interviews, and especially when I started to transcribe the interviews. I had some help transcribing, but I did a lot of the editing of the pre-transcribed interviews and a lot of raw transcribing myself. But I realized that everybody I talked to experienced the 1950s as a decade of job insecurity and economic instability. All right.
Mm.
It was
Wow.
shocking. The number of times people were laid off that they tried to be auto workers, weren't able to be auto workers, was really surprising to me. It ran completely counter to what the historical literature had to say about the period and what popular memory has to say about the period. And so I was wondering, well, what do I have here? Did I just locate the 40 to 45 people who weren't able to make it in this period of
Yeah.
prosperity? Because it's a
Mm.
pretty small sampling out of the hundreds of
It is.
thousands of
Yes.
people. Yeah, and
Mm.
and so historians don't just fabricate stuff. We try to
Yes.
figure out sources that that we feel comfortable making conclusions from. And in this case, I wasn't at all comfortable drawing any big conclusions from this small sample.
Mm.
But any people watching right now can see that the book that I was envisioning with those
Mm.
interviews is much of what Listening to Workers became, because it's a collection of these life history narratives. But I
Yeah.
took a detour at this point. Okay, so this is a long
Okay.
answer to your question.
No, that's good. This is fascinating.
Yeah, uh, I was so struck by the fact that I was finding this counter narrative to the
Mm.
decade that I thought, well, I can't do 1,000 more interviews or 100
Mm.
more interviews. It's so hard to transcribe. It's so hard to locate people. I would never have a representative sampling anyway in any sense that a social scientist would accept as
Yes.
legitimate,
Yeah.
right? Um, uh, and so I decided I would read Detroit newspapers. Okay, I read the Detroit Free Press. Read the Detroit News. I read the Michigan Chronicle, and that's an African
Mm.
American
Mm.
weekly newspaper that's still published in Detroit online now. And uh, I just wanted to see, if I read these local newspapers, would I see a story of prosperity and
Mhm. Yeah.
economic security, and or would I see what the interviewees were telling me? That's where the daily walks to the bus stop came in, because I found so much stuff. All these newspapers had large staffs. They were long newspapers, tons of articles. None of it was digitized, so I'm reading it on microfilm, which
Yeah.
your eyes go batty.
Yeah.
And what I found was that the newspaper evidence completely confirmed what the people I interviewed were telling me. There wasn't anybody in the 1950s except a couple people at the Detroit Board of Commerce who thought that the auto industry was stable, that auto industry jobs were secure, and that auto workers were, rising into the middle class. The story was completely the opposite. And so that leads to another, discussion of historical memory and all this.
Yeah.
But I took a detour. So why this book
Mm.
became why another book. And
Mm.
I wrote a book called Disruption in Detroit that was really about this insecurity and instability.
Mm.
It focused on the newspaper research heavily because that provided kind of a narrative arc to the economic
Mm.
insecurity and instability. But I used a lot of the oral history evidence from the workers I interviewed. For instance, if there was a big layoff in fill in the blank year, 1956, I could chart the evidence I had from interviews and supplement the argument with that evidence. Um, and so I really thought that it was important to get that argument out there first. Um, and it took a number of years to write that book because there was so much evidence, and I'd cut 500,000 words out of that one, I think. But
Yeah.
uh,
That's quite a lot.
yeah, well, whatever, you do what you
Yeah.
have to do. But anyways, what I was getting at is that I, I I never would have thought to do the newspaper research if not for the
Mm.
gifts I was given from the
Yeah.
people I interviewed by telling me about their lives. I was just going through their lives as much as I could in chronological order. Um, but I felt like I hadn't done justice to them. I was using oral history evidence in a perfectly appropriate way, taking snippets of evidence out and plugging it in
Mm.
to back up the argument I was making. But you couldn't tell from Disruption in Detroit who these people were, what they
Mm.
hoped for, what they dreamt for, how they lived
Mm.
their lives, what they cared about. And those are the things that were so rich in the interviews that I conducted. And so I dedicated myself then to going back to the original book. This is
Mm.
the long-winded part, coming back home
Yeah.
to Rooster,
Yes.
in my metaphors or whatever. But
Yeah.
um, I wanted to put their lives back together. And the way I
Mm.
distinguish the books is that Disruption in Detroit, oh, really put the lives of the auto workers in the context of auto work
Okay.
in the auto
Yes.
industry and that narrative. And Listening to Workers is the other way around. Auto work is just kind of slipped into the lives of these people as it fit, as they live their lives. And so it's a much fuller, much richer portrait of who these workers were. And that was my initial vision of
Oh,
the
okay.
book. And so I might be stumbling into answering questions that haven't been asked yet, but um, there's kind of a labor history aspect to this, academic aspect,
Mm.
which is that historians thought that auto workers were
Mm.
all focused on
Yeah.
union contracts and making higher wages and benefits and all this. And I'm not saying that's untrue, but I'm saying that their lives were far richer than that, far
Yeah.
more. complicated, and that in many cases, all of the union negotiations in the 1950s, all the riches, uh, they didn't experience
Yeah.
because that they were laid off so much and they were young and they're starting families and trying to do all the things you have to do to get launched in life. And there were certainly, most of the people I interviewed were only auto workers about half of the decade. And so it called into question whether or not I was really studying auto workers or if I was studying people who were doing secondary jobs, the whole time, installing fences and uh, serving in restaurants and all these sorts of things. So that's the long-winded answer, but I was really interested in history from the bottom up, oral
Yeah.
history, labor history. It all came together with auto workers, and no research project ends up the way you envision it at the start. And this was no exception. It turned.
Yeah. Oh,
And so,
definitely. It's
yeah.
an excellent, weaving of both books together and arriving here at listening to workers. And you talked about it a little bit through that this part of the interview.
Mhm.
But could you speak just a little bit more about how you would define this work? Because
Mhm.
this particular book for the audience who um, uh, may not have been too interested in oral histories
Sure.
or reading nonfiction in general, and how, how would you define this book?
Yeah, I don't have a category at the bookstore
Mm.
label for it.
Yeah,
But I was defining at the end of my last answer kind of the academic niche for it,
yeah,
which would
mm,
be, oh, it turns out that auto workers were a whole lot
mm,
more complicated than we thought they were before, and that's kind of
true. Yeah,
I'm the publisher is an academic press, University of Illinois
mm,
Press, so you have to meet those kinds of obligations.
yes,
Where does
that
the
is
work
correct.
fit in? I'm not opposed to that, but I really think that how I would define it for the most part for the Michigan Notable Book audience and
Mm,
how I've defined it in my visits to libraries
mm,
around the state is an interesting collection of stories about
okay.
people.
Mm,
And I'm hoping that people can see this as kind of a string of biographical sketches that would
okay.
inspire them to maybe talk to their parents, interview their grandparents, interview
Mm,
other people, and find out the richness that lies beneath
yeah,
the kind of the person we project things onto, right?
yeah, yeah, correct.
And so you can read this book and enjoy it without reading any of the academic stuff in the intro or the
Yeah,
conclusion. I don't think that that stuff is
very true.
useful, but you can just
Yeah,
ignore it, and just
mm,
read these stories. And I think a lot of people, if they're older, they relate to it because they experience some of this stuff,
mm,
their own version.
yeah, mm,
But I think it spurs maybe a more honest and authentic way of exploring people's lives. Because you never know what you're going to get with oral history. And at certain times in people's lives, they might be protecting, not wanting to talk about certain things, framing things certain ways. And you never have a perfect window on into the past with oral history, but you do collect a sense of how people interpret their lives at the moment of the interview. And most of the people I interviewed were in their 70s and 80s, and they were ready to kind of let it loose, like, hey,
yeah,
one guy, Gene Johnson, came in and said, "Well, I debated even this morning whether or not to come in and talk to you, but I decided I was going to talk to you, and I'm going to tell it like it was.
okay.
It's going to be embarrassing sometimes, but everyone would have truths like this in their past if they were honest." That's what he said. And that's kind of what I was going for, I think.
Well, it really does come out. It's a really engaging book to really delve into individual lives and just day-to-day activities and how they were carrying on and surviving.
Yeah.
And that really stood out to me when I
Thank you.
read this book. Um, you sort of touched on it from, here and there. Um, what would you say, maybe they're not really characters, but what would be some of your favorite, interviewees, or maybe your
Yeah.
favorite moments, gathering these stories?
Yeah. Wow. Um, Yeah, I have to, say that it was really painful to have to cut out some of the narratives from the book version. I had more
Okay.
written, and I felt like I was getting rid of friends and family
Mhm.
members, in a way.
Yeah.
And so, in a way, if you ask me which is my favorite character, it's like asking you, who's your favorite kid or something. They're not my children. I don't own them at all.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah.
Or I have no stake, in their lives or their stories, really. But there are three that just stood out to
Mm,
me as so remarkable, so candid, that um, and part of that's because they were
mm.
really forthcoming with their
Okay.
answers. You know, you can only write about what you learn in the interview, and if someone
Mm,
gives short answers, you don't learn as much. But there are three. One is Margaret Beaudry. I'll never forget her. In the intro to the book, I voice hope that I'd be able to hand deliver a copy of this book to her. She turns 100 this year, and I
wow.
was able to do that. I was able to do
Well,
that. Yeah.
congratulations.
Yeah, I handed her a copy of the previous book, Disruption in Detroit, and she looked at it and the table of contents and didn't see her name because she knew that this was the kind of book I was aiming for. She said,
Yeah.
"Not that book. I want the book that I'm in." And she was
Understand.
a tough advisor.
Mm,
So let's see. But I encountered her at a regional UAW picnic. It was one of the metro parks. I don't remember which one. And she was leading the karaoke component of the. She had her own karaoke machine up there. She's belting out the Broadway songs,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
that was her dream, to be a Broadway singer.
Really? Okay.
She was a Rosie the Riveter during World War II.
Mm,
Um, she got married at age 16 and then got a job in an auto plant during the war. Lied about her age, racked her with guilt.
yeah.
Yeah, but it's a rollicking story. Her life. Um, just one little snippet. One of her jobs was to process water pumps for shipment overseas during the war to go into military vehicles in Europe. So her job was to pound little corks into the openings in the water
Okay.
pump. Okay. And just
Mm,
keep debris out of them so they were shipped overseas and put together. And occasionally she'd tap a cork and it would just be too small to go inside the water pump. And she put another one over the top of it and send it off. And this, of course, I'm not a big mechanical guy, but this caused
yeah.
overheating, with vehicles
Yeah.
in the war zone because the
Mm,
cork would float around, plug the hole. And so she was brought in before the FBI in the middle of the war.
oh,
She's, I think 17 at that point.
yeah.
And she was accused of being a saboteur to, and she just blew up. She was like 5 feet tall, had a
Mm,
temper. And she said, "My husband's in the war, my brothers are in the war, my uncles are
yeah.
in the war. How dare you?" And
Mm,
the FBI agents just kind of backed off. Okay, all right. And it just goes on like that. There's a man named Gene Johnson who is from Southeast Missouri, and he grew up picking cotton. He said, "There's no job in an auto plant that compares with picking cotton. Cotton and picking is so much harder, so much dirtier, just so much awful, more awful." And I just really appreciated his stories. There's so many to choose from. I don't know where to go right now, but he as a little kid was selling homebrew alcohol, on the streets illegally to
yeah.
try to make it through the depression.
Yeah.
Uh, when he was just not even 10 years old, he was already playing bluegrass music in honky tonk bars with his father and brothers. Uh, what a guy. He uh, had a son who was born with what's called, I don't know if I'll pronounce it correctly, leg calf perthes disease. It's a disease that causes you to lose the function of your legs. Um, and it resolves on its own in time. But he gave up his military career and really became an auto worker because he couldn't afford to be away from home. They had 4 kids and one needed to be transported everywhere. But he and his wife decided to give faith healing a try when an extended family member said, come on into the church and we'll see if we can pray this disease away. And
Yeah.
in his telling, that night his son was able to walk again. And again, it does resolve, but in his view, it was an act of God, and he converted his whole life to Christianity at that point.
Okay.
Refused to work Sundays, almost lost his job,
Mm,
lost his hearing in a stamping plant,
wow.
a department. And he was kind of wistful, saying, it was a good life, but he really missed playing that honky tonk music in the bars. He played in the church orchestra, and he said it was
Yeah.
good, but that's where in my style of writing, I can kind of convey a little bit about the tone and the
Yeah.
gestures and body language and all. But he's amazing. L.J. Scott, an African American. Um, Grew up in Alabama, and he was really good at math, and he kept ledgers, and he challenged the landowner. They were sharecroppers when it was time to settle up at the end of the year. by confronting the white landowner with arithmetic about how much they owed and how much they should get paid for the cotton. He put his family's lives in jeopardy, and they had to constantly move. Uh, and then he carried on that ledger keeping to jobs he had in the Pontiac area. He lived in Detroit, but got a job in Pontiac. Got fired because he realized he was being cheated, in
Yeah.
wages, and he got drafted into the military, but in the segregated army of the time. He was consigned to the kitchen and got into fights with white officers who wanted him to give them extra food and all this, and so that kind of discrimination and his ways of fighting back extended into Pontiac Motor and the plant there, trying to get promotions that he deserved over the white people who got the positions. And he was just really reflective about all these things he had been through. In a lot of the interviews, people kind of shook their heads and said, "Well, I can't believe I've gotten to this point." And I guess that was one of the
Yeah.
gifts I could give them, to put their lives
Yeah.
in a recording, give that recording to the family and all. So to call them my favorites would probably be accurate, but I wouldn't want that to
Yeah.
suggest that I didn't like the others.
Others, yeah.
But they were just something richer
They-
in their storytelling. Maybe the
Yeah.
examples were a bit more vivid.
Mm.
But I was really pleased, even for the ones that kind of were just straightforward, because that's the way a lot of lives were lived, and the way people reflected on them at the time. And there was nothing really straightforward about them, quite honestly. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So that kind of can moves us to a different line of questioning. What did it mean to you to have your work selected as a notable book?
It was really exciting for me, I gotta say. You tipped me off. I appreciated that, that this was coming. And I was familiar with the program, but hadn't really paid that much attention to
Mhm.
it, before. But when I came to understand more about all that you guys did to
Mhm.
go through the process of selecting the books, and right from the get-go, I understood that what this meant is that you thought that someone would read this book and get something out of it, and that it was
Mhm.
accessible, and that's what I always strive for. I think that all historians
Mhm.
do, but a lot of times we fall way short, in part
Mhm.
because of the academic conventions that we have to meet, and in part
Yeah.
because there isn't necessarily a correlation between research skills and writing skills,
Mhm.
and so I was really excited to think that people, I didn't realize you were involved, until let me know, but that people in a room could read a whole bunch of books and say, hey, this one is one that someone might read and get something out of and actually enjoy, and that is so meaningful that I thank you for all the work that you and the others put into the selection process.
Okay. I would say as an aside, how were the tour stops that you participated on?
I
I mean,
really enjoyed it.
okay.
I've got the southwest and west side
Mhm.
uh, spots, I guess. I went to Dowagiac, Three
Mhm.
Rivers, Buchanan, Ionia, Fremont.
Okay.
And what I encountered were really dedicated library staffs doing their best to
Mm.
provide a critical community function, sometimes under siege from the community,
Mhm.
and sometimes with pretty solid support.
Mhm.
But I really enjoyed the audiences.
Mhm.
There
Okay.
were, a lot of these towns, almost everything was auto related at some point,
Yeah.
with a parts plant or some
Mhm.
kind of assembly plant. And so there are people who are familiar with their city's history, their village's history, that were there. Sometimes larger crowds, sometimes smaller crowds, but always
Mhm.
enthusiastic crowds. And I learned so much from them that it was really wonderful. You sometimes wonder when it's a 3-hour drive, you're like, I wonder if this is going to be worth it. It was always,
Yes.
it was
Oh,
always,
good.
yeah.
Good, good, good. So wrapping up our conversation, the last question I wanted to ask is, which writers or works have you found yourself reading recently?
Wow. You caught me at a time when I've been doing a whole lot more gardening and dealing with a family crisis than,
I
everything's
know, I
okay,
know.
mind you, but
Yeah.
but I do have several of the Michigan notable books ready to go
Really?
here because I
That's
really
good.
enjoyed the event in Lansing as well, when I
Mm.
got to meet a number of the authors, and
Oh, good.
it's on, it's something I'm looking forward to doing. But right now, I'm doing so much reading and rereading of stuff that I've assigned for classes. So
Yeah, because it's that time of year now.
it is. So to be honest, it's earlier in the summer, I was catching up on a number of works in my field that had
Mhm.
escaped me because when you're doing research and writing, you focus on your
Yes.
topic so narrowly that you lose track of a lot of the stuff that comes out that's a little bit wider ranging. But I'm looking forward to reading more widely in the future. I don't have a book project in the works right at the
Okay.
moment, so I can go back to what drew me to graduate school in the first place, just learning stuff and reading all the other wonderful writing that's out there.
Okay. Well, excellent. Sounds wonderful. I want to thank you, Daniel, and all the listeners, viewers out there for watching this Michigan Notable Book author conversation. And for those of you who want to watch more of the other Michigan Notable Book author conversations, please visit our website at michigan.gov/notablebooks. Thank you.